Hello, everybody. Today we're going to talk about human anatomy and drawing the human body. Now, the human body is one of the most complicated and intricate things there is to draw. There are so many layers, from your bones to your muscles to fat, cartilage, and every other little piece that makes up the human body. And each one of these things affects and reacts to one another. It is a wonderful machine that allows us to perform complicated movements and tasks, and really to draw the human well, you need to understand how the human body works. Now, we're not doctors or scientists. You don't necessarily need to know every single bone, muscle, and tendon that makes up the human body, although it certainly would help. What's really important is understanding the proportions. Because when you start to break it down into simpler forms, you start to notice that there really is a harmonious beauty to how everything is put together. Ideally, it really takes a lifetime of drawing the figure from life and from references to get really good at making it up out of your head. Like anything else in life, it takes practice. And because it's so complicated, it takes a lot of practice. Even the most experienced artists out there still go to live figure drawing sessions every single week because they're still honing their craft. Most of the artists at the top of the industry use references, whether it's a model they photograph or themselves in front of a mirror, to help draw an accurate human figure. But you never want to totally rely on references because sometimes they can be stiff or it's difficult to get the correct pose you need. So that's why having a thorough understanding of the proportions of the human body and how the human body works are essential to the artist. So the first thing we want to look at is the proportions of the human body. Because even though it seems complicated at first, when you start to break things down, you start to see that there are a lot of really great simple rules that you can use to help you draw the best character possible. The first thing I want to talk about is the golden ratio. You may have also heard it called the divine proportion, the Fibonacci ratio, the golden mean, the golden rectangle. All these things are talking about the same thing. And what that is a mathematical ratio that is commonly found in nature. And artists have used this throughout time, and it's something that you can find again and again in nature itself, from bees, ears, seashells, the solar system. Over and over again, we will see this golden ratio. So at first, it can seem complicated, but simply put, if we have a line here and we divide it into two parts, we have A and B. It states that if A is 1, then B is 1.618 times larger than A. So it's a proportion, 1 to 1.618. And this is a proportion or ratio that we will see time and time again in nature. And now I want to just make sure you guys understand that this is a harmonious ratio. And I want to mention harmony because we're not talking about anthropological ratios. We're really talking about here as artists. We want to look for these type of harmonies and things that tend to work out and come together. So, if we look at the human body, it is filled with the golden ratio over and over and over again. You can find it everywhere, and you can build the human body using the golden ratio. For example, if you were to measure the length of the first digit, or phalanx 3, it is 1 compared to the second digit is 1.618 times bigger than that. If you compare the second digit, or phalanx 2, to phalanx 1, it is 1.618 times bigger than that. If you look at the metacarpals, is 1.618 times bigger than phalanx 1, which is the third set of digits. If you look at the hand compared to the elbow, it is 1.618 times larger than the hand. If you look at from the elbow to the center of the chest, is 1.618 times larger from the hand to the elbow. Over and over and over again, you see this ratio. Going even farther, if you go from compare the head to the shoulders to the navel, 1.618, 1 times larger. If we look at the bottom of the feet to underneath the knee, compared to the bottom of the knee to the navel, 1.618 times larger. If we look at the whole upper torso compared to the lower torso is 1.618 times larger. And you can see this everywhere. Again and again and again. You can break down the entire human body into this beautiful, magical ratio, 1 to 1.618. And you'll see that golden ratio again and again and again. But in reality, we're not going to really use the golden ratio that much. It is a nice thing to know, but it's not a very practical way to measure things out. Really, the best way to measure things out is the human head. That is our most basic form of measurement that we're going to be using to create our human body. A head is equal to the size of the foot. If you go from the shoulder blade, top of the shoulder blade, to the base of the shoulder blade, that is 1 head high. And as I'm going through these, I want you to think about these things. Look at your own body. Start measuring things out on yourself. See how it lines up with yourself. The distance from the armpit, if your arm is outstretched, from the armpit to your elbow is 1 head high. The rear end, from the very top of it to the bottom, or the pelvis, if you want to think of it that way, 1 head high. Now the hand isn't perfectly 1 head high. The hand is actually 3/4 of a head high, but that is an important measurement to understand, that your hand is 3/4 the size of your face. Now if we go to 2 heads high, if you go from under the knee, which is under the patella, to the bottom of the feet, 2 heads high. The femur, that is the big bone in the upper part of your leg, from the top of the femur to the bottom of the femur, is 2 heads high. The elbow, from your elbow to the tip of your fingers, and that's whether or not it's straight or bent, is 2 heads high. The upper torso, from your clavicle to your hip bones, 2 heads high. The actual width of your shoulders from arm to arm is 2 heads. Go to 3 heads high here. Your arm itself, if it's extended from the armpit to your fingertips, is 3 heads. From the base of your skull to the bottom of your rear end is 3 heads. 4 heads high. From the top of the head to the bottom of the pelvis or the rear end is 4 heads high. And the leg bone, or the leg itself, that's in upper portion of the leg and the bottom portion of your leg, is 4 heads high perfectly. All in all, this amounts to 7.5 heads high for an adult human. Now, these are really important proportions I want you to think about. It's something that will come up over and over again. As I said, I want you to think about your body. I want you to look at yourself in the mirror. Start measuring yourself out. And keep in mind that I am making a lot of generalizations here. The human body is going to vary from person to person, and there's a lot of factors that can affect that, from gender to ethnicity to how much you weigh, how much muscle you have on your body compared to how much fat. All these things are factors that will affect the proportions of the human body in general. So we're looking at a generalization here, that the typical human body is about 7.5 heads high. So I really want you to pay attention to these proportions. That's going to be essential to helping you build the human body that looks accurate and believable. So, using our human head as our form of measurement, from the top of the head to the chin is 1 head high, right? The hand itself is 3/4 of a head high. If you look over here, just a reminder, if you actually put the heel of your hand to your chin and then your fingertips will reach just past the eyebrows. So that is the basic size of your hand itself. Going down from there, 2 heads down, just under your chest, right about lined up with the nipples. That's where 2 heads goes to. 3 heads high, lines up almost perfectly with the navel, or the belly button if you want to call it. So that's our top 3 heads, is our upper torso. So then we're going to start measuring from the bottom up. From the bottom of your foot, up 2 heads is the bottom of the patella. So the bottom of the kneecap is 2 heads off the ground. From there, 2 heads up, you get the top of the leg, which is the top of our femur is called the greater trochanter. That is 2 heads high, which gives our legs a total of 4 heads. Our legs can be cut up beautifully in half at the knee, 2 heads on the top and 2 heads on the bottom. And then that leaves us with that little bit of half a head that's right in the middle where your pelvis fits in there. The shoulders are 2 heads wide. The elbow, where the actual your elbow bone there is, it fits right in between where your rib cage and your pelvis are. It lines up right in the middle of those two. And it's basically at the small of your waist. And you can test that out on yourself. Look at your elbow. It fits right into that little small of your waist there. The hand, the tip of your fingers, fall halfway down the thigh. You can stand up, measure it yourself, see that your hands, the tip of your fingers measure halfway down your thighs. And that's important that you know that so you don't make your arms too short or too long. It's always at halfway down. The arm itself, and you want to think about your arm outstretched. It is 3 heads high, which I already talked about. If this was outstretched, it'd be from underneath the armpit out, it would be 3 heads. Or when it's down like this, you can think about the humerus here. This is like the head of the humerus in the ball and joint socket, right at the bottom of where that piece is, down to the tips of your fingers is 3 heads high. When your arm is bent, and this is a really important ratio, you can see that from the shoulder to the elbow is the same length as from the elbow to the knuckles. They are about equal. Once again, try it on yourself. Bend your elbow. See that the tip of your knuckles line up with your shoulder. That's a really important ratio to understand. And the middle, the very middle of the human body is right in the middle of the pelvic bone or just above where the genitals are. That is the center point of the human body. When comparing the male body and the female body, it is important to know that there are some differences. Generally, the proportions of the male and the female body are pretty much the same. Both are still drawn at 7.5 heads high. But there are a few differences that are really important to know because that will make a difference, how your character will look if you want them to be male or female. Now, typically, women are drawn shorter than men, so that means they have a smaller head than men, and then the rest of their proportions still line up. It's just all a smaller version. Now, for this example here, I put them both the same height, so you can really see how everything lines up. Now, the major difference between men and women is the difference between the shoulders versus the hips. A man's shoulders are much wider compared to his hips, and a woman's hips and shoulders are about the same width. So you get a much different proportion when you see the characters here. So the men will tend to have big, broad shoulders, and women will just tend to have narrower shoulders here. So when we talk about, the human figure being 2 heads wide, that's typically talking about a more male figure, whereas a female figure is more like 1.5 heads wide. It's a little bit narrower. And the narrower part on the female figure on the waist is much narrower than the male figure. The nipples themselves are actually a little bit lower on the women than the men. That's important because remember we said that 2 heads down is where the nipples are, but women, especially over time as gravity tends to take hold, those will get lower and lower. So it's not a total fixed point here. The widest point of the human body is different on men and women. On men itself, the widest point is actually where the greater trochanter is. That is where your femur attaches to your pelvis. That is that bone. You're literally seeing it on the surface there. That is the greater trochanter, is the widest part of the male. And it's lower on the female thanks to those nice little fat deposits on the thighs. So the women's widest point on their legs tends to be right below the hips on their thighs there. And then women's arms, wrists, fingers, ankles, everything tend to taper at the ends and get a little narrower, where male figures tend to be boxier. And this is something you want to keep in mind too when drawing male figures. People tend to draw male figures more angular, more boxy in general, and women tend to be a little bit curvier when they draw them. When we look at children, it is very important to know that the proportions of children are very different than adults. If you ever need to draw a child, you need to understand how things compare and how it changes over time. Now, the big thing you really need to understand is that the head does not grow very much from when you're born to when you are full size. A 1-year-old's head is about 6 inches, and an adult's head is about 9 inches. So really, you're only adding about 3 inches of growth up and down from first year to adult. So that means when you're looking at a 1-year-old, in relation to their body, their head is pretty big. A 1-year-old is only 4 heads high. A quarter of his body is his head. As he gets larger, a 3-year-old is 5 heads, a 5-year-old is 6 heads, and a 10-year-old is 7 heads. Where you really see the most growth is in the legs itself. The legs grow nearly twice as fast as the torso itself. So that's where you're going to get a lot of your growth here. Now, just like in perspective, you need to know the rules before you can break the rules. That is very important here, and that's why it's important that you understand all of these proportions. A normal, realistic human adult is drawn at about 7.5 heads high. But as long as you keep the same general principles, you can distort and alter the proportions to enhance your character. So if you want to make a character that is more of an idealistic or more of a superhero or fashion model, you can stretch out these proportions so that your character is more like 8 or even 9 heads high. And it's understanding those proportions that allow you to make characters that look realistic but can have these believable sizes. It's by really understanding those proportions. Or if you want to make a character that's more stubby or older, you can give them more childlike proportions that are 5 or even 6 heads high. But even in a caricature, you really want to make sure 2 really important things. That is distance from the shoulder to the elbow, and then the elbow to the knuckles are about equal. Remember when you bent that arm and you see that your knuckles line up with your shoulder? You always want that distance to be about equal. And then you want your hip bone to the bottom of your knee to be about equal to the bottom of the knee to the floor. Those are equal sizes. That is the key to making a character look really believable. And then from there, that's where the fun starts. If you really understand these proportions and you memorize and practice over and over again these different proportions, you can create any type of character. It can be realistic to stylized, it can be from young to old, however you want to work. If you really practice and memorize these proportions, you can do anything with your character and create them any way you want that still feels believable. That's the key. You can have something that's crazy, stylized, and unique, but you still want them to be believable in some way.